So, okay, let's get into this. What is money? Why this subject? Why? I mean, it's been touched on. A lot of people have written about it before. Can I tell you what I think? It felt like you are looking at where we're headed, and to look at where we're headed, you need to see where we'd come from.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. And I think it's also one of those things where every several decades, or every better part of a century, there's a big transition, in the last couple centuries about how we treat money and how money works. Basically, in part, money is a technology, right? So, and as technology changes, what we consider money changes, and then you add geopolitical, realities on top of that. And so, I wanted to prepare people for what kind of I think we're going through this decade, because people often are used to picking investments, getting out of investments, getting into other investments, but they don't often think about the money itself. And funny enough, people in emerging markets think more about what is money, right? Because they often have to deal with a weak money, and so they want dollars instead, or they want other types of assets. Whereas people in developed countries hardly ever have to think about money. And it's also, there's so many things it touches on, because it goes into the whole Bitcoin versus crypto thing. What is money versus what is some VC tech platform, right? It's like all these kind of questions go to what assets do you want to hold over the course of the next 10, 15 years as we go through some of these really big macro transitions. And it's kind of starting from first principles of what is money. And then, of course, the article draws from so much great expertise that is out there. Some people that are, long dead from the 1800s. Some of the references are older than that. And then other people, of course, that are active, in various communities, including people in gold, people in Bitcoin, people in fiat, even. Kind of like just all these thought leaders, and saying what is their view of money, and how do I interpret that? How do I tie these together? How do I contrast these views of what is money?
So what I'm hoping from this is we get a show that I can send out to all my friends who I'm still struggling to get them to even consider the nature of money. And over the last, I would say 18 months to 2 years, I'd used Facebook as a testing ground. So Twitter that's out there in the noise with all the other crazies, but Facebook is friends and family, and I've tried to share ideas with those about why Bitcoin is important, why thinking about money is important, and nothing's landed. And to echo your point, even though we're at high inflation in the UK at the moment, I think we're at 6% in the UK. We know it's higher. We've seen a massive increase in commodity prices. My energy prices are up personally nearly 300% in a year. I filled up my car the other day when I went back, and it was something like £120 to fill up the car, probably double what it would cost here. But I still think people aren't fully understanding what's happening to their money. Whereas when I've been on trips with the show, when I went to Venezuela, it was a really important experience, because people are using 5 different types of money, ranging from the bolivar, which they had to use, wanting dollars. Some people using Bitcoin, some people using the Colombian peso, and then that stupid crypto they created. We won't talk about that. But they really did understand money, and I think sometimes you're forced to understand it when it collapses. I think this insidious inflation we go through hasn't forced people to consider it enough. Some have, some haven't. So I think today is going to be super important. I'm hoping this is a show I can put in front of people, and people really think about that, because there is a lot of risk to money right now.
Exactly, all around the world. So for the longest time, you only had to care if you were in developing countries where they have currency crises. But now developed markets are going through kind of a debt crisis and an inflation crisis they haven't really gone through since the last time money had a big change, right? Since money changed from gold back to fiat. That's the last big money change that happened. And this environment kind of looks like that whole environment. And that whole thing was a process, right? So you kind of slowly started severing money from gold. It started in the World War I era, and then the aftermath specifically. And then it carried on to the Great Depression. And then, of course, it carried on to World War II and the end of that, where you kind of had like a loose peg to gold, but not a direct connection. And then it was really in 1971, of course, it was completely severed. And that whole period we're kind of going through almost like a mirror image today, right? There's a bunch of charts that I show in all my articles of how debt, what debt looks like, what the deficits look like, what interest rates look like, and it's kind of a mirror image of that whole period. And so I think people have to be prepared for the changing nature of money, the digitization of money, so money becoming more digital in various ways, and how it's easy to fall into traps and think like this is money versus is not money. And it's actually, you have to go back to first principles and find out what is good money? What do I want to hold longer term?
Well, the starting point, when anyone does ask me what Bitcoin is, I always say it's money. That's it. It's just a form of money. And I used to try and come up with these kind of more complicated answers. But really, I've simplified it down to just explaining that it's a form of money and then explaining the properties. But an interesting question, I'm going to jump around a bit here, so excuse me, but an interesting question for me to put to you is, we've had these periods where money has changed and money is a technology. If we had no Bitcoin, or we had no digitization, if there wasn't a technological change right now, but we were still going through a currency crisis, do you think we would see another change in the nature of money? Do you think the central powers would come together to do another Bretton Woods or another? Because it feels like we have this weird coincidence that at the time we're having this these currency crises around the world. We have had, fortunately, over a decade of something like Bitcoin to establish itself to be an alternative.
I think if you didn't have the creation of Bitcoin, one is that gold would be rising a little bit more in prominence than it is. And you can also kind of separate it between the sovereign level and the personal level, right? So we just saw, for example, the case I've been making for a while is that sovereign reserves are going to probably begin diversifying more than they have. So if you back up a long time, gold used to be the primary reserve. Then with the whole kind of Eurodollar, petrodollar system, they started putting the US Treasury at the heart of the whole global reserve system. And ever since really 2013, 2014, you've been seeing a little bit of a shift back towards sovereigns, being interested in holding gold as part of their assets, because they kind of could, compare that currency. They could treat it like money, look at it versus other fiat currencies, and it has certain advantages. It has a lower monetary inflation rate, and it has, you can self-custody it in a way that you can't do with liabilities of other entities, like other countries, right? So those can be frozen, but if you hold gold in your vaults, it's yours. And so there's been an uptick in interest in gold. It's also the only, alternative money or outside money, you can call it, that's big enough to absorb, kind of these large sovereign flows. But now with the invention of Bitcoin, it's interesting because it's more accessible to people around the world. Anyone with a smartphone really can for the most part access it. And it's too small for many large sovereigns at the point, but it's something that over time could become more interesting there. So I think that in the absence of it, we would see maybe kind of a return to gold. But the problem is that gold was somewhat flawed as money. Its shortcomings in terms of portability, audibility, things like that. So there's a reason why we disconnected from gold. And so I think that for lack of better alternatives, there'd be some kind of shift back. Either people would want to preserve their purchasing power, or even sovereigns would want to preserve their purchasing power and sovereignty. But now there's another option. So now there's kind of multiple things to look at. And then you have to compare not only fiat, you have to compare gold, you have to compare Bitcoin. You have to go around and be like, what properties am I looking for in a money?